Welcome to this week's Finest in 5, where we deep dive into the current events shaping Australia's real estate market. In today's episode, we're going to go through the current stats on first home buyers. There's more first home buyers than ever. Does it price you out of your dream? You'll find out. And we'll go through 11 freaky houses. There's some interesting ones there. Let's dive right in. Welcome to the Buying Your First Home podcast, your personal guide through the Australian housing market. Here we tackle the big questions and the small details that come up when buying your first home. From financial prep to finding the right neighbourhood, we're here to ensure that you've got all the knowledge at your fingertips. So let's take the first step towards unlocking the door to your new home. All right, guys, so starting from the top, the changing perspective on first home buyer numbers. Now, interestingly, there's been a 150% increase in home value index over the past 2 decades. This is specifically looking at first home buyers. Simon, what is going on here?
Yes, so Elisa Owen from CoreLogic just recently published a bit of research around first home buyers and some finance data about what's happening with first home buyer finance and in the market in general. And there's some pretty interesting figures here. So there's been a $4.9 billion increase in first home buyer finance just in February itself. In the past 12 months, the value of first home buyer lending has risen by 20.7%. That's 4 times the amount of non-first home buyer owner-occupied lending. So there's a lot more growth in people who are first home buyers getting finance. But the question is this really a sign of a healthy market, or is there sort of something underlying here that is sort of not telling the full story?
Yeah, and it looks like with all these price increases over the sort of time frame they've looked over the last, I think it was 20 years, that there's been a 150% increase in prices, but only 82% increase in wage price index over the same period. So property prices have gone up, but wages haven't quite kept up the same way. And it's interesting to see since 2006, the proportion of owner-occupied finance that was first home buyers, there's been some peaks and troughs in there. There was a particularly large peak in 2009 when they doubled the first homeowner. It went up to 21,000 in some states on existing properties, and then a bit of a dip from 2014 to 16. And then since the home guarantee scheme introduction a couple of years ago, we've seen that increase from the proportion of first home buyers, which was about 25% longer term. It's almost 30% of the buyers in the market now. So we're seeing some of these government schemes, it's not getting easier, that's for sure, but these schemes have helped a lot of people get their foot on the ladder and get into that first home buyer market.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the other takeaways here is that the first home buyer lending is definitely going up, which is good to see people are out there being able to go and buy a home. The growth may not be completely due to more first home buyers getting a home though. So if people are looking for their second home, or if they're downgrading, it's entirely possible that they're taking out smaller loans or not even taking out a loan at all. So some of these figures, when you look at them sort of superficially, they look like they're saying one thing, but if you can dive in a bit deeper, it's possible that, there isn't as big of a shift in terms of the actual behavior of the market, at least as far as first home buyers are concerned.
So with housing affordability, the cost of living, a pretty big topic this year, and I think it'll continue to be into next year. CoreLogic's housing affordability report's been released, and it's showing a potential, rental market squeeze. So rent is now eating up more income. So the national median rent to income ratio is a record high of 32.2%, meaning renters are spending almost a third of their income on rent. It's particularly brutal for sort of the lower income earners, with the 25th percentile spending a whopping 54.3% of their income on rent.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we did have a recent minimum wage increase as well, but in terms of impact, that all just pretty much went to rent. So the wage increased, but then rent hikes went up. So it wasn't really a lot of relief there for the sort of lower income renters. So it's a bit of a difficult situation, because if you are trying to buy a house, the more you spend on rent, the less you can afford to save for a deposit. And so CoreLogic is now estimating that it'll take over 10 years for somebody on the median income to save a 20% deposit for a house. So an entire decade just to save your deposit.
And this is where I think they're going to have to do some more work. Like the home guarantee scheme has been amazing. You can get in the market with a 5% deposit. In New South Wales, they've tweaked some of the stamp duty concessions, but some of the other states just haven't caught up with that. Like in Queensland, the stamp duty is only waived on homes up to $500,000. And you don't have to look far, and we'll cover this later in the episode. There are units for under $500,000 in Brisbane, but you're not getting a house for under that. So I think the state governments need to do some work to potentially look at some stamp duty reprieve for first home buyers to try and make it a little bit easier. And even with the government home guarantee scheme, with some of the price caps in Brisbane it's 700, Sydney it's 900, Melbourne's in between. So they might need to do some work on there just to understand, well, the market's moved since these schemes have been established. We might need to move some of these caps too.
So I guess the takeaway here from this one is that if you are feeling like it's tough to save a deposit in the current market, you're not alone. I think a lot of people out there are struggling. But the thing to consider here is like, it can be difficult, but what are some creative solutions that you can do to overcome the hurdle of saving a deposit? So if you are renting at the moment, you could always consider, and if you have the opportunity, like sharing a house with more people, or even some people move back in with their parents for a little while to save up the deposit. I mean, these aren't the most ideal solutions, but sometimes you need to think outside of the box in terms of ways that you can still move ahead with your plans to buy a house.
And keep in mind too that you don't need 20%. With these government schemes, the minimum's 5%. As we've covered on other episodes, your first home doesn't need to be your forever home. So it could mean that you're going to be living in a unit further out for the first couple of years. To get that home under your belt means you're going to get out of the rental market at least and put your own roof over your head. But that can be an upgrade. And like Simon said, for some of the stats, with a lot of upgraders now, their home equity's grown, and it means their second home's easy to get into.
Absolutely.
Next up, 20 years of poor property growth. Is the property party over? This was a funny article, Simon, because it was a bit of a boohoo for investors. They were complaining and saying that, all the good times over. Over the past 2 decades, median house growth has been 5.3%, which is lower than the preceding 20-year period, 1983 to 2003, where the median house price growth was 8.7%. So they're complaining that then they got 5.3% compared to 8.7%. I mean, cry me a river, people. Like, this is not fair.
I mean, this article is written for property investors, but it just strikes me as pretty much out of touch with the average Australian first home buyer. They're like, oh no, we can't make such a good return on our investment. In the meantime, property prices are the higher they've ever been. And it's really hard to actually get into the market at all. So I just thought this was an interesting take to see, like, well, what's it like on the other side of the fence? Some people are complaining about getting poor returns. And there's a few reasons why it's harder to get in. So borrowing capacity is another thing that has changed. So 20 years ago, the amount that you could borrow based on your income was a lot higher. There's been a lot of changes in terms of how the lenders assess borrowing capacity, and they have stronger rules about your income. And income hasn't matched the same rate as the property growth either. So you just think, well, maybe they should consider what it's like for the people who are looking to take that first step on the ladder and, give us a bit of empathy, perhaps. It's not that these guys are wrong. It just feels like they're not really in touch with the entire housing market. If you're an investor, this probably feels true to you. But the first home buyers, they're certainly dealing with some different challenges.
Absolutely. So which brings us to our next point, the suburbs, where you can buy a unit for under $400,000. This has been an interesting one. Even from a YouTube channel, there's been comments on there where people are like, what are you getting? Like a cardboard shed? It's just impossible. Yeah, you're not going to get in the premium locations, but there's definitely places around Melbourne and Perth and even Darwin where you can buy units for under $400,000 in cities. And again, it can be that stepping stone with affordability. So Simon, let's dive through some of these.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are places in every capital city where you can buy a unit for under the $400,000 figure, or even around the $400,000 figure. So let's just look at a couple of cities. So for example, in Brisbane, you can get an apartment in Woodridge where a median price of $310,000. So that's like very approachable. And places in Beenleigh, Waterford West, Slacks Creek, and Ipswich, they're sitting around that sort of $380,000 to $400,000 mark as well. So these might not be the fanciest units or in the best locations, but they are that crucial first step in terms of getting access to being on the property ladder.
And same in Sydney, you can look around Wally Park, Fairfield, Blacktown, Cabramatta for under 435,000. In Melbourne, there's Flemington, Travancore, Melton West, Harkness for around 370. So there are definitely options there. They're going to be one bedroom. You need to check out the square meterage. I had a client that was buying in South Yarra. She found a unit for 350,000. The only tricky part was the internal square meter was under 50 square meters. So there are some banks that do have restrictions on this. Some banks will actually count the balcony and also the car space in the square meterage, but just keep that in mind with some of those cheaper units in probably the nicer areas. There could be some restrictions or different things that banks are looking for. Certainly the ones in sort of Beanley and some of the ones we'd had a look at as a part of this, they were over 50 square meters. They sort of meet the requirements, just it's a little bit further out from town. So you're getting it for a bit of a cheaper price than if you're buying something in central CBD.
Yeah. And, if you're not attached to living in, like, say, if you're living in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, and you're not attached to living in there, like, explore some of the other places in Australia. Darwin, for example, more than half of all unit sales in March were priced under $400,000. So there is a lot of options in some places if you're willing to consider geography and where you might want to live. And, it could be a good experience as well off the bat. So I think the key thing here at this article is units and houses. Everyone, ideally, most people want to start off by buying the forever house, the house with the backyard, which we always talk about. But starting off with the unit, it's a great stepping stone. As we covered last week, the unit prices are actually growing faster across Australia than house prices at the moment. So there is more of a shift of people looking at units as a really viable option, and it's worth looking at. And the other good news here is if you are willing to sort of take a glance and give some of these other locations a bit of a chance, you can get into the market pretty cheaply, which I think is encouraging.
That's amazing. And then wrapping it up, you've got 11 wild real estate listing photos from around the world. Probably not going to work well on a podcast, but let's try, and we'll include the link below. But yeah, kick us off, Simon. This first one from Adelaide is pretty freaky.
So I had to share this because it's just some wonderful wild ways that you can find on these real estate listings. So there's this house in Adelaide. You look on one of these pictures, there's a doorway and there's a creepy old door, and there's just a small child holding a teddy bear, looks like it's straight out of a horror film. And it turns out that's just a sticker on a sliding door. But at first glance, you'd be thinking, am I buying a haunted house? Is that why it's so cheap?
Then there's some other weird ones. There's like a house in Virginia that's a farm. That's like those old style, big open gallon with a mezzanine floor upstairs. But in the main dining area, there's a full 1-to-1 picture, like a model of a horse, like a stuffed horse that's part of the dining room that's in there. That's so creepy to be eating dinner next to a real life horse that's been stuffed and staring back at you.
I think my absolute favorite from this is this property in Victoria. And I think it has to be the most creative way to sell an empty block of land that I've seen. So the pictures show you this wonderful, it's like a Star Wars spaceship looking kind of house. And, from afar, it's like, wow, lovely house. And then you click on the pictures, and what they really have are just artists' renderings of what this house could look like. So with plans, permits, and engineering completed, all the hard work is done. And you can take over and begin construction to buy this Star Wars spaceship house. So really getting a block of land, a couple of permits, and some plans. I just think it's kind of genius.
Amazing. So we'll include the link below. All right, Simon. So wrapping it up, it's looking harder, but it's not all bad news for first home buyers.
Yeah, look, we had a bit of a whirlwind tour there of the property market. The first couple of articles we talked about, the market is tough. There is no sugarcoating as such. Price increases, wages aren't keeping up. These aren't just numbers on a page. That's your savings being stretched further and needing bigger loans just to get in the game. But it's not hopeless. Even in the pricey cities, there are still pockets with affordable units, and, rentals are tight, but you can also look at shifting to buying a smaller place and paying off your mortgage instead of paying off someone else's. And I think what we finished off here with these other listings is that the perfect house doesn't exist. Some people might want a spaceship out in the middle of Victoria. Someone else might want a creepy kid sticker on the doorway of their house. If you're finding the perfect house is a mirage, finding a place that ticks off most of your boxes and is a place that you can see yourself living in for the next 3 to 5 years, I think is what really we should be looking for.
That's it for today, guys. If you liked the episode, make sure you leave a review. And if you need any help with finance, hit us up at huntergalloway.com.au. Until next time, see you later.